Welcome to the Holistic Psychiatry Podcast. I'm Courtney Brown Snyder, a physician and holistic adult and child psychiatrist. In this episode, I'll be talking about the dismissive and avoidant attachment style. So, in the previous episode, I discussed attachment and how our early life experiences, in terms of our relationships, specifically in the first 3 years, can shape our neurophysiology and impact our ability to regulate emotions, and also how we think about ourselves and how we think about others and relationships. The obvious questions became, what do we do with if we have some insecure attachment patterns? I have a lot to say about that, and specifically I will focus today on the dismissive-avoidant or avoidant-dismissive attachment style, which is on one end of the spectrum, and then do a follow-up where I'll talk about ambivalent, preoccupied, more of an anxious attachment style. And as I mentioned last time, a secure attachment style, which falls in the middle of the spectrum, is really where we're able to have positive self-esteem, we're able to trust others when appropriate, we're able to experience autonomy, but also able to experience connection and intimacy, and we're able to express our emotions, recognize bodily sensations, and also to resolve conflict effectively enough. And again, as I talk about this spectrum, keep in mind that it really is a spectrum. So rarely are people perfectly secure in their attachment style, and there's a lot of fluidity here, and when we're under more stress, we could even exhibit more of our insecure attachment if we have some of that. But what I'm going to focus on is more the extremes, and that would just help really highlight these patterns. But it doesn't mean that most people are falling in these extremes. I will put in perspective, when these were compartmentalized through research, the findings show that about 50 to 60% of people do have a secure attachment style. This does appear to be decreasing in U.S. children. It's showing to be about 40% in some research. On the avoidant-dismissive attachment style, which I'm focusing on today, it's about 25%, and that's actually gone up. So let me just start with how attachment is measured in toddlers and then adults. And as I do that, I'll talk about what secure attachment looked like in this research and what dismissive and avoidant attachment style. And I'm always referencing these styles with two names because one comes out of the toddler research and the other comes out of adult research. They're the same thing essentially. To start with the early research with toddlers, this came out of the work of Dr. Mary Ainsworth, a psychologist who basically created a situation where a toddler could be under enough sort of attachment stress to see how they would react when reunited with their caregiver. So these were situations that were videotaped, and it would start with a parent, usually a mother, and she would be sitting in the chair, the child would be playing nearby on the floor with some toys. A stranger would come into the room, like someone like a therapist, and then the stranger would leave. The mother would leave again, and the stranger would come back in, which would be creating more stress. One, the child's been alone, but now there's a stranger coming in without the presence of the parent. Then the mother comes back in, and again, a second reunion, but after more stress for the child. So the observations were about, first, how able was the child just to play before all this happened. Then what was when the parent and child reunited, what did that look like? How did the parent respond to the child, and also how did the child respond to the parent? How much did they seek comfort? How much comfort did that parent give? And again, when the stress was increased with the stranger coming in, how did the child react to that? And with, again, being reunited with the parent. So with secure attachment, they found that the child was able to explore their environment. They felt pretty comfortable. When the parent left and they were reunited, they did seek comfort from their parent, and the parent was able to, seemingly tuned in, able to respond and meet the child's need for comfort. And I think we can all know, without me going into detail, what that could look like. Just proximity, just picking up a child, just looking into their face and just being, again, tuned in and responsive. Now, with an avoidant and dismissive attachment style, what they found was the child wasn't really able to explore their environment very well. They seemed somewhat detached and inhibited in what they would do in terms of how they would play with their toys. When they were reunited with the parent, it was noted that the parent wasn't particularly responsive, but it was also noted the child wasn't seeking anything from the parent. In fact, they noticed that there wasn't a distinction made necessarily between the stranger and the parent. So, again, this would be, when we talk about attachment studies that were in toddlers, they did find that this translated to what you could predict what this would look like in terms of adult emotional expression and adult ability to seek connection, enjoy connection, and to have healthy relationships. And it was predictive of how these toddlers would go on to even parent their own children. So I won't talk about it so much here, but when I talk about the traits of avoidant-dismissive attachment style, there is a lot of overlap with undermethylation. These individuals tend to be very left brain oriented. Now, when we think about undermethylation, it's a biochemical phenomenon. When we're talking about attachment, it's really a environmental and experience that's shaping someone's neurophysiology. So the whole nature versus nurture argument. And I'm always of the belief that, multiple factors are typically aligning. However, there is evidence, in fact, that early caregiving can potentially impact the epigenetic expression of methylation genes. They've studied this in mice and other rodents and found that the licking and grooming of the pups by the mothers did have an impact on the expression of methylation genes. So that doesn't mean that everyone that's undermethylated necessarily didn't have an optimal attachment experience. We all come with a degree of genetic loading, some of us a lot more genetic loading, and some of us come with a lot more environmental loading. And it can be difficult to weed those out. But there's many undermethylated people who enjoy positive connections, who are able to express their feelings. And they don't have the personality patterns that we see with individuals who have had an attachment experience that left them without a positive belief about themselves, others, and an ability to connect. What are those symptoms? Well, before I talk about that, let me comment on the adult research. There's different ways that this has been done through questionnaires, but one of the research approaches that was originally done was by Mary Main, and these were interviews done with adults in which they would ask them about their early life experiences. Not this time that I'm referencing in the first 3 years, because many people can't verbally and consciously remember that, but more about their families, childhood, and what experiences of loss or rejection or abandonment they may have had. And then they'd noted not simply what was being told, but the way in which it was being told. So someone with a secure attachment style would be able to give a very nuanced response as far as, this was wonderful, I really enjoyed this part of my childhood and my relationships. This is how I felt about my mother and my father. And then they could also say, and you know what, this wasn't so great. There was this dynamic here, or felt like this person in the family was favored, or when this happened. So they're able to give a balanced approach, which, is ultimately what we're all after, is wholeness. We're not after perfection. We're just, our humanity is not designed that way. So that would be indicative of a secure attachment. Now, someone who's on the dismissive-avoidant end of the attachment scale, interestingly, when they're asked about those experiences of childhood and family and abandonment, loss, and rejection, things were perfect. Everyone was perfect. No loss, no abandonment, no rejection, no experiences that left them feeling hurt. And part of this is because they don't have a good ability to access their emotions. And again, if your emotions haven't been acknowledged in early life, it's going to be really hard for you to be able to recognize and tolerate and even notice those feelings in your body. It doesn't mean that they're not there and can't be excavated, but there's not the same access as someone who expressed feelings through crying, was responded to, and this back and forth, and building trust and relationship. So it really is a different experience that shapes one's physiology. So again, they wouldn't necessarily have the feelings to even be able to comment on in a nuanced sort of way. But also they wouldn't know better in terms of, they wouldn't necessarily know nuance. They wouldn't know big picture thinking as well. Remember, as I talked about last time, part of what grows our right hemisphere and our ability to have compassion and connection and think creatively and intuitively and to feel embodied, so in our body and not just a bunch of parts, is this right hemisphere is grown through our early attachment experience. So if someone hasn't had a lot of that, again, they're not going to be able to experience things as nuanced. Things will be more black and white. And it makes more sense to people, especially as they're trying to protect their ego and their unexcavated feelings, to just have everything neatly wrapped up in a pretty box, as opposed to being able to bring out some of the things that might be a little uncomfortable. For people on the anxious, preoccupied end of the spectrum, which I'll talk about, unwrapping that box could be quite overwhelming. Again, the opposite end of the spectrum. So just to reiterate the traits of someone that is on the dismissive and avoidant attachment end of the spectrum, that would be someone who doesn't have good access to their emotions. They aren't able to easily express their emotions. They aren't able to recognize bodily sensations associated with their emotions. They have difficulty trusting others, with connecting. They certainly have difficulty with intimacy and showing vulnerability. They have difficulty resolving conflict. So their relationships, if they're in relationship, can be marked by detachment, but it can also be marked by control, in some cases domination. So if someone has a personality disorder diagnosis here, it would be in the form of a narcissistic personality disorder, an antisocial personality disorder possibly, or an obsessive compulsive personality disorder. Now that's different than obsessive compulsive disorder. So now I'd like to talk about what someone can do if if they identify with some of the things that I'm talking about. And again, if you think about the pillars of the limitations, it's around feeling. So that's something that needs to be sort of learned and excavated. It's around beliefs. That's something that can be learned through experience, and I'll talk more about this. There's limits around connection, showing vulnerability, being able to listen to others and not just jump in and dominate. There can be a need to learn how to resolve conflict and not just go in and try to fix things, and really learn the ability to put oneself in another's perspective. So there's tools for all these areas, and that's what I'll comment on, starting with feelings. And first I'll point out that relative to other areas on the attachment spectrum, these individuals are probably the least likely to recognize that they have an attachment-related issue. You know, sometimes we don't know what we don't know. And if that's the case, these individuals would be less inclined to seek out treatment, which certainly is the case with people who are have narcissistic personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, and even obsessive compulsive personality disorder. It's usually people coming into treatment for other things, such as depression and anxiety. Now, these individuals can have depression and anxiety. Their depression is more typically in the form of an apathy, again, because they're not necessarily experience and show a lot of emotions. So when they're not enjoying life and happy, they would be experiencing more of an apathy, again, instead of sadness. There could be anger. With their anxiety, it might be more in the form of ruminations as opposed to a high, palpable type of anxiety. When you look at someone and you know they're anxious, these individuals could be anxious, but it would be more of an internal rumination. So for those, however, who do start to really cognitively recognize that their lack of ability in expressing emotions, sharing emotions, their difficulties with connection and intimacy, and problems with avoiding conflict. For those who start to recognize that, they may seek out psychotherapy. Now, psychotherapy is a great way to, in the presence of another human being, even though it's based on a financial relationship, it's a place where someone can learn to have their feelings, to recognize the sensations in their body associated with those feelings, to be heard and listened to, and to really learn how to listen to themselves. So these more extreme ends of the spectrum that I'm talking about, that can be especially important. Although even for people with milder difficulties in this direction can also benefit from psychotherapy. There are different types of psychotherapy, and I would say for some people it may be that they start out more with a cognitive approach, trying to recognize and make sense, but then ultimately what is required is really learning how to feel and how to become that responsive caregiver to oneself in allowing feelings, recognizing the feelings, and finding a way to be present with oneself and to provide self-care. There can be ways to learn emotional expressiveness too that involve things like journaling, creating art, even singing and dancing can be ways of expressing a range of emotions. Now those could feel especially threatening to someone, especially who's kind of restricted in their emotional expression. However, those are things they could learn to do alone, and to have favorite songs and learn to sing those songs. You know, just because someone has an avoidant and dismissive attachment style doesn't mean it's not there, that it can't be excavated. And very often those feelings are coming out, they're just coming out sideways. They're coming out in the form of, let's say, passive-aggressive behavior, or sometimes people lose their temper about one thing because they're upset about something else. Or when they're sad or angry, they might start to ruminate and control things. So again, there's ways in therapy, there's ways individually. Journaling is a great way to scan what someone experienced that day, what emotions arose. And even work around internal family systems, as it's now called, but also for those who like the work of Carl Jung, looking at shadow work. You know, within our shadow lies our full range of feelings, those parts of ourselves that we don't like to think about, though are still there, and our greatest attributes, and it's all wrapped up. And we have a persona that we present to the world, but if we're not regularly checking in and noticing and integrating those other parts of ourselves, they can cause us problems. And also, by not integrating those parts of ourselves, we aren't able to live more fully. There's a lot of treasures that lie there. So, beyond work that people can do alone and in the context of therapy, can certainly also be relationships with other people. Ideally, relationships with people that have a secure attachment style. Someone that's on the other end of the spectrum, their overwhelm and excessive emotional expression is not necessarily what is to be learned, nor does it necessarily feel safe to someone who's avoidant and dismissive. But if they find themselves or able to have a relationship with someone with a secure attachment, there's a great deal that they can learn. And there are other therapies. There's group therapy where people can learn how to work through conflict in healthy ways. A colleague of mine calls group therapy the all-purpose cleanser, because there's just so much opportunity to express oneself, learn how to express oneself, learn how to listen, and that can be particularly important with someone with an avoidant attachment style, to really learn how to be present and listen to others. Because if you're not listened to when you're young, and you've never learned to listen to yourself, you're certainly not going to be able to listen to others. But these are all things that can be learned and grown, and part of our being around people that have health in these areas, or even people that we admire, gets those mirror neurons firing, and we do learn a lot unconsciously from each other. So paying attention to those people in our lives who are securely attached, who are emotionally expressive in healthy ways, and who know how to work through conflict is important. Family therapy can be helpful, but not at the expense of someone doing their own work. Because to try to do family therapy with someone who's dealing with extreme attachment-related issues, that work will be very limited if they're not in parallel, or at least initially starting with their individual work. And part of that obviously being couples therapy, to help with connection, getting comfortable with vulnerability, and even becoming comfortable with intimacy. It can be helpful just in terms of leisure is certainly to consider activities that aren't so goal-oriented, not competitive, just ways to be with people in social situations that don't involve one-upsmanship, or someone having to win and someone having to lose. Thinking about things like what one reads. If somebody is very left brain and wants to read self-help, not even self-help books, but how to get ahead books, how to be successful, that's only going to reinforce this very linear way of thinking. So instead, maybe read some fiction books and look at movies that tap into more the heart instead of, again, this linear trajectory to improvement and success that is great, but at the expense of, but the goal here really is to become whole, not to become perfect, not to become the best. And taking people off that linear path can also be learning to do things that are creative. I will link to a post I have about undermethylation and how to access the right hemisphere, because I think all that would be helpful here. Not part of attachment related work that I would recommend is that people also consider, if they're undermethylated, to look at undermethylation and consider seeing a clinician who knows how to provide treatment for that, specifically Walsh-trained doctors. People who are undermethylated that don't have any depression or anxiety can benefit from one approach, but for brain-based type symptoms, from a Walsh perspective, we use different approaches. I have a link on undermethylation that I'll share. So if there's things like toxicity, inflammation, that are also exacerbating undermethylation, that can make people have more difficulties accessing emotions, basically lowering their neurotransmitter activity and thus making them look quite detached and avoidant in their attachment style. Some people with high pyrroles and a discomfort being around people, too much stimulation, can also look like they have this. But the attachment piece is usually a pervasive pattern over time if left uninterrupted. And there's goals for oneself to improve these patterns, but there's also the benefits of how one then will go on to parent their children. If their children are older and even adult children, it can make the difference in how they communicate with them, how they work towards healing, how they help their own children recognize what they might have been missing in their own early life because of a family transgenerational pattern of insecure attachment. So I hope this is helpful to you. I think if you watch a lot of films and if you read a lot of books, novels specifically, you will see this story arc of people that are restricted in their relationships, emotional expression, and then they have something that happens to them or they meet someone and this way of interacting is no longer working for them. What was a survival pattern is now keeping them from thriving and experiencing all there is to experience as a human. And so you'll see that story arc and you'll see people going through a resolution. Of course, it's much faster in the movies and it's not necessarily always that way, but I think it does point out, appropriately so, that there is always hope, there's always room for growth, and that we've been gifted with neuroplasticity, and just like learning how to do any other skill, we can grow parts of our brain that allow us to live more wholly and fully. I look forward to connecting with you in a future episode. If you're not subscribed and would like to receive these by email, you can subscribe at CourtneySnyderMD.com. Also have information there about my treatment practice and my non-patient phone consultations that I offer nationally and internationally. Until next time, take care.